אחי, משאלת ליבי ותפילתי לאלוהים שיבשעו. אני מעיד עליהם שיש להם קנאה לאלוהים, אבל קנאה שאין עמה דעת. כי מאחר שלא ידעו את צדקת האלוהים וניסו להקים צדקה משלהם, לא נכנעו לצדקה של אלוהים. הרי המשיח הוא תכלית התורה, כדי שיוצדק כל מי שמאמין. משה אומנם כתב על הצדקה שמתוך התורה, אשר יעשה אותם האדם וחי בהם. האיגרת אל הרומאים, פרק 10, פסוקים 1-5. Brothers, my heart's deepest desire and my prayer to God for Israel is for their salvation, for I can testify to their zeal for God, but it is not based on correct understanding. For since they are unaware of God's way of making people righteous, and instead seek to set up their own, they have not submitted themselves to God's way of making people righteous. For the goal at which the Torah aims is the Messiah, who offers righteousness to everyone who trusts. For Moshe writes about the righteousness grounded in the Torah, that the person who does these things will attain life through them. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 10, verses 1-5. Complete Jewish Bible. Shalom Alechem Uvruchim Hashavim, peace be upon you and welcome back to yet another educational and enlightening episode 11 of Finding Higher Ground. Brought to you in spirit and in truth by your American-born, Israeli-raised, fluent in Hebrew, Manic Messianic from Seattle, Washington, USA. Your host, Gotti Higher. Sponsored by Anchor, powered by Spotify, and motivated by Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit of Adonai Elohim, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. This podcast episode of Finding Higher Ground was recorded with Audacity, professional-grade audio mixing software downloadable for free at audacityteam.org. Beyond outstanding motion picture quality background music and sound effects provided by epidemicsound.com. And a very special thank you to www.oneforisrael.org for allowing me to share with you from their book, Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus, How the Torah Fulfills Its Goal in Yeshua the Messiah. One for Israel Ministries, the spearhead ministry paving a way for Adonai Elohim, the God of Israel, and bringing Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, and Palestinians to the knowledge of Messiah Yeshua. My dear listeners, believers and non-believers, both from near and afar, it is such a pleasure and a privilege and an honor to be back with you, to share with you the good news of salvation through the Messiah Yeshua, and all the knowledge that's been privy to me by Ruach HaKodesh himself. Thank you so very much in joining me on my mission to make the most famous Jew in all of history even more famous. For 3 years, there was a dispute between the school of Shammai, in Hebrew, Beit Shammai, and the school of Hillel, Beit Hillel, the former asserting the law, halacha, is according to our view, and the latter asserting the law is according to our view. Then a voice issued from heaven announcing, the teachings of both are the words of the living God, but the law is in the agreement with Beit Hillel. But it was asked, since both are the words of the living God, for what reason was the school of Hillel, Beit Hillel, entitled to have the law determined according to their rulings? Because they were kindly and humble, and because they studied their own rulings and those of the school of Shammai, Beit Shammai, and even mentioned the teachings of the school of Shammai before their own. Babylonian Talmud, Eruvin 13b. The singularly ethical way Beit Hillel conducted themselves during disputes also made them more likely than their opponents to reach truthful conclusions. For one thing, because they were kindly and humble, their egos did not prevent them from acknowledging truth when stated by the other side. Second, they made a point of stating their opponents' positions, not just viewpoints with which they already agreed. This guarantees that they reached a conclusion only after a thorough examination of all sides of an issue. From the perspective of Jewish law, whether or not a court subpoenas you to testify is irrelevant. All that matters is whether you know something that can advance justice. If you do and refuse to tell what you know, you are guilty of a serious sin. A half-truth is a whole lie, Yiddish proverb. All are excerpts from Jewish Wisdom by Joseph Telushkin. I most humbly apologize, my dear listeners, for keeping you waiting, as I had some inner issues to attend to. I have felt somewhat disheartened by the lack of activity on my Anchor podcast dashboard. I feel as if some of you out there in the podcast universe, some of you might be having a hard time stomaching what I've talked about in my previous podcast, episode 10, Cut a Baby in Half. And while I deliberately did pick that title for shock value, I did merely quote from scripture, where both the king and the lady, the second prostitute, the shady hoe, both said, cut the baby in half. And if anybody is offended by my referring to them as hoes, then I am sorry, but I'm not sorry, because that's exactly what they were. They were prostitutes. That might be more refined word for their profession, but whore and prostitute are the same thing. So I, much like those offended by certain words, had to get over myself and my feeling demoralized. Because at the end of the day, my podcasts are not about me, they're about him. They're about the one who can offer you a much more abundant life if you put your trust in him and his promises that are good and sound, rather than the empty promises, false promises that the world has to offer you. The reason why the promises of this world are false and empty is because that this world is temporary and fleeting. What is visible is temporary, and what is invisible is eternal. And that is actually scripture in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18. We concentrate not on what is seen, but on what is not seen, since things seen are temporary, but things not seen are eternal. So why, dear listener, would you want to put all of your energy and time in something that is temporary? Something that you will eventually, at one point in your life, lose? Why don't you put your energy and time and efforts into something that is eternal, that you will never lose? So in this episode 11, I'm going to break down the chapters of the book Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus, published by oneforisrael.org publications and lexhampress.com. You can find them at lexhampress.com, Lexham press.com. And once again, thank you from the bottom of my heart, One for Israel Ministries, for giving me permission to share with my listeners and of course the rest of the world this amazing book. It's not a big book, it's a small book, it's very thin, but there's so much to unpack, so much wisdom and knowledge from heaven to unpack in this tiny book. Do not judge this book by its size, much like Jedi Master Yoda. Even though this book is small, The Force is very strong with this one. In episode 9 of Finding Higher Ground, titled Do Not Boast Against the Branches, I began at the end of that podcast to talk about this book, this amazing book, Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus, How the Torah Fulfills Its Goal in Messiah Yeshua. I'm going to recap. I'm going to go back just a little bit and recap so that we can continue from this point on. Many people read the Torah through the lens of Rabbinic Judaism, in which the Torah is understood to be a law book. To follow the Torah is to keep the commandments of the Sinai covenant. We disagree with this common assumption. And when I say we, I mean by the 3 Israeli Messianic Jewish doctors that have put this book together. They proceed to state, rather, our thesis about the purpose of the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, is that it is a historical narrative whose purpose is to lead Israel through the broken law and beyond, namely to the Messiah, who Moses assures his readers will come in the last days. To be faithful followers of the Torah, in our view, is to believe in Yeshua. See John 5:39-47. We defend this thesis by looking at several key passages in the Torah. In chapter 1, we look at the Torah's introduction, Genesis 1 through 11, and conclusion, Deuteronomy 29 through 34. By looking at the Torah's beginning and ending, we see that Moses prophesied Israel's future breaking of the law and subsequent exile before they entered the Promised Land, suggesting that his primary purpose for writing the Torah could not have been to lead Israel to, but rather through the broken law and beyond. In chapter 2, we look at the account of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, Exodus 19 verse 1, all the way through Numbers chapter 10 verse 10, situated between the wilderness narratives leading to Exodus 15:22, all the way through 18:27, and then away from Numbers 10:11, and then 36:13, Mount Sinai. We see a direct relationship between the giving of the law and a breakdown of Israel's faith, the result of which is death. See Romans 7, 9, and 10. This textual data provides yet more evidence that Moses' purpose for writing the Torah could not have been simply to lead us to the law, but rather through the law and beyond. In chapter 3 of this book, we demonstrate where the Torah is aiming, if not toward the law, it is aiming toward the Messiah. We look at passages that speak about the last days. We argue that these passages reveal the ultimate goal for which Moses wrote the Torah, namely to bring us through Israel's breaking of the law and to the Messiah in the last days. Chapter 4 introduces the creation mandate, God's pattern of blessing that is played out in the story of Adam and Eve. We see Adam as God's first and prototypical king and priest, illuminating his creation purposes for humanity. Chapter 5 takes us to the rivers of Babylon. Adam experiences the consequences of his disobedience in the form of an eastward exile, which is a prefiguring of Israel's later exile. How can Adam, Israel, overcome their disobedience and be restored to God's intended blessings? Chapters 6 through 8 take us through 3 selected poetic speeches in the Torah that reveal how the creation mandate will finally be restored through a special individual from a specific lineage who will crush the head of his enemy. Chapter 9 answers the question, why then the law? Galatians 3:19. By bringing to light 6 prevailing functions of the law. Law as tutor, shadow, theology, love, wisdom, and prosecuting attorney. Chapter 10 gives us a way of understanding the archaic, sometimes bizarre laws that we encounter among the 613 commandments or mitzvot given at Mount Sinai. This brings us then to chapter 11, where we encounter the impossibility of keeping the law of Moses. We look at how it became impossible to keep and how the rabbinical sages responded to this national identity crisis, giving particular attention to the oral law, or in Hebrew, HaTorah shebe'al peh, as opposed to the written Torah, the written law, HaTorah shebichtav. In chapter 12, we look at what it means to be a Messianic Jew and our relationship to the law and to Jewish tradition. The conclusion summarizes our findings and offer a final challenge to the reader. Before we formally begin our study, let us state quite clearly the purpose of this book. First, we wrote this book to provide an answer for questions about the believer's relationship with the law. With the rapid growth of the Messianic movement since the early 1970s, more and more believers are realizing two simple yet profoundly world-shaking facts. Fact number 1, Jesus, Yeshua, is Jewish. Fact number 2, we cannot understand the New Testament without carefully studying the Old Testament. These two discoveries have resulted in a growing number of believers, both Jewish and Gentile, who struggle with questions about their relationship to the law. Second, we wrote this book to show how Yeshua is the Torah's goal. For some people, a few verses in the New Testament suffice. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. John 5, verse 46. For Messiah is the goal of the law of righteousness to everyone who believes. Romans 10:4. While we affirm the truth of these verses, we believe it is incumbent upon every believer to examine the scriptures daily to see how these things are so. Acts 17:11. To say that Yeshua is the goal of the Torah is one thing, but to prove it from the Torah is entirely another matter. There are only a handful of messianic prophecies in the Torah: Genesis 3:15, 49:8-12, Numbers 24:7-9, and then 17 through 19, Deuteronomy 18:15. If our conclusions about the Torah's goal were a matter of mathematics, we could easily conclude that the law is the purpose of the Torah, since references to the Messiah are few and far between, while verses referring to the law occupy roughly half of all the verses in the Torah. However, from beginning to end, a singular story is told in the Torah, not just in a smattering of verses, but woven into its very fabric. Perhaps, by examining the narrative structure of the Torah with its many parallel storylines and recurring themes, we may see signposts pointing consistently and undeniably toward the Messiah and our need for him. All are welcome here. We hope readers of this work will include those who believe that Yeshua is the promised Messiah, both Jewish and Gentile, and those who do not share that belief, both Jewish and Gentile, and that for all readers and listeners it will be a journey of discovery. It is our sincere expectation that by the end of this book, and hopefully by the end of my podcasts, you will have sufficient and satisfying evidence for proclaiming with Philip and with the writers of this book, quote, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Yeshua of Nazareth, Netzrat, the son of Joseph." John 1:45. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1, the Torah anticipates lawbreaking. Through New Testament eyes. Paul states in Romans 10:4 that the Messiah is the goal of the Torah. And I'm going to quote here from the English Standard Version, which I am not a huge fan of. For Christ, Messiah, is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Now there's a little number 1 at the end of the word believes. We're going to look at that in a minute. In John 5:4-6, Yeshua argues that since the religious leaders do not believe Moses, they do not accept him as the promised Messiah. Quote, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me." End quote. Likewise, in Matthew 5:7, Yeshua says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Now, right over the word prophets and over the word them at the end of that paragraph, there is a 2 and a 3. These are all little side notes that we're going to touch. Side note number 1 deals with this translation from the English Standard Version. or Christ, Messiah, is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Now, this little number 1 cliff note says, there is some debate whether or not the word telos should be translated as the end of the law, i.e. for establishing righteousness, or the goal, i.e. the intended destination of the law. Though the context appears to support the latter interpretation, both interpretations have merit. In my Complete Jewish Study Bible, I do believe that it does make a note that it should be interpreted as goal instead of end, because end suggests elimination, and Yeshua did not eliminate the Torah, he completed it, as we've just read in Matthew 5:17. The second footnote, footnote number 2, has to deal with, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. So let's take a look at that. Footnote number 2 says, in the context, Yeshua is referring to the Torah as a whole and not just to the law. This is clearly the case because of the way he places the law side by side with the prophets. And then the third footnote at the end of the paragraph here on page 21 of chapter 1, the Torah anticipates lawbreaking. The third footnote deals with Matthew 5:17, when Yeshua says, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them, meaning the mitzvot, the law of Moses. And the footnote there is, let's read that. 3. Some in the Hebrew roots movement attempt to back-translate the Greek into Yeshua's mother tongue in order to understand not the verbal meaning of the Greek text, but the so-called real meaning behind the Greek text. By appealing to this logic, some would argue that Yeshua did not come to fulfill the Torah, but to interpret it properly. I personally don't like that. There are 2 very serious flaws with this school of thought. First, it is notoriously difficult to back-translate Koine Greek into Hebrew and or Aramaic. Interesting. Any and every back-translation will always remain at the level of conjecture. A second flaw resulting from the first has to do with the authority of the biblical text. When our understanding of the biblical text rests in a conjectural back-translation, the authority of God's word no longer rests in the biblical text, but in the scholars who provide the back-translation. The Gospel of John clearly teaches that God gave his Spirit to the disciples after Yeshua's ascension to teach them all things and to bring to their remembrance all that he said to them. John 14:26. See John 2:22, 12, 16, and 29. Because the disciples were uniquely anointed by God's Spirit to preserve Yeshua's teachings, their translation of Yeshua's words into Greek was inspired and therefore completely authoritative and reliable for faith and practice. Very interesting. Alright, so that was the third footnote. Let's continue with the actual text itself. The author of Hebrews argues that the law was never a goal and of itself, but rather it prescribed a system of worship that was divinely intended to point people to the Messiah. He writes about the tabernacle. By this arrangement, the Ruach HaKodesh showed that so long as the first tent had standing, the way into the holiest place was still closed. This symbolizes the present age and indicates that the conscience of the person performing the service cannot be brought to the goal by the gifts and sacrifices he offers, for they involve only food and drink and various ceremonial washings, regulations concerning the outward life imposed until the time for God to reshape the whole structure. That was, by the way, Hebrews 9, verses 8 and 9, but I read them out of the Complete Jewish Bible instead of reading them out of the English Standard Version, which is actually what's in the book. The book also tells us to look at Hebrews 10:1, so I'll read that out loud as well, from the Complete Jewish Bible. Hebrews 10:1, for the Torah has in it a shadow of the good things to come, but not the actual manifestation of the originals. Therefore, it can never, by means of the same sacrifices, repeated endlessly year after year, bring to the goal those who approach the holy place to offer them. The New Testament teaches that the Messiah is the goal and fulfillment of the Torah as a whole and the law in particular. How did Yeshua, Paul, and the author of Hebrews come to such conclusions? Are their conclusions based on the grammatical historical interpretation of the Torah? Or can one only arrive at such interpretations by reading the Torah through the lens of the New Testament writings? These questions are particularly relevant when we consider that verses about the Messiah in the Torah represent less than 0.5% of all the verses in the Torah. We believe the authors of the New Testament did not impose added meaning on the Torah, but actually understood the original meaning intended by Moses when he wrote the Torah. This is called exegesis. Now that was the end of page 22. Page 22 has 2 footnotes, 4 and 5. Footnote number 4 deals with are there conclusions based on the grammatical historical interpretation of the Torah. So let's look at footnote number 4. Footnote number 4 says, that is the literal interpretation of the meaning intended by the original author. Footnote number 5 deals with the Greek word exegesis, which I had to actually say over and over and over again properly until I got it right. Exegesis, spelled E-X-E-G-E-S-I-S. Exegesis. Footnote number 5. Exegesis is the process of interpretation whereby the reader seeks after the grammatical historical meaning of a text, more specifically the meaning intended by the text's historical author. Let us proceed to dig deeper down this rabbit hole. The deeds of the fathers are assigned to the sons. Page 23. If the ultimate purpose of the Torah is to provide Israel with the law and to motivate them to keep it, we should expect to find some indication of this aim in its introduction and conclusion. Genesis 1 to 11 and Deuteronomy 29 to 34. These are chapters. Since introductions and conclusions in biblical literature typically contain the major themes and purpose of entire books. In order to understand the purpose and meaning of Genesis chapters 1 through 11 and its function as the introduction to the Torah, let's look at a common literary feature in the Genesis narratives. It is described by the rabbis as Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim, meaning the deeds of the fathers are assigned to the sons. Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim means Moses wrote stories about the patriarchs not only to tell us about the patriarchs and about those who preceded them, but also to tell us what would happen to the descendants of those patriarchs, i.e., the nation of Israel, in the future. Though some scholars use this Hebrew phrase, others identify this literary feature as narrative typology or literary analogy, an English name we prefer to use. Though some may accuse us of deferring to allegorical interpretations to reach our conclusions about the meaning of the stories in the Torah, this is not the case. Literary analogy is a tangible, identifiable feature in the text itself, and was recognized by ancient and modern interpreters, Jewish and Christian alike. There are also commonly accepted and recognized criteria for making the claim that one text was intentionally written as an analogy or foreshadowing of another text. 1. Shared words and phrases, lexical parallels, and 2. Shared plot, thematic parallels. And at the end of the word parallels, there's another footnote, footnote number 6, and footnote number 6 says, we also make use of a third criterion, namely the history of interpretation. In other words, it is extremely helpful to find others in the history of interpretation who recognize how one story foreshadows another, or how one story is written in the light of an earlier story. The book then offers examples to shared words and phrases, lexical parallels, and then shared plot, thematic parallels. For example, the Torah's description of Israel's exodus in Genesis chapter 43 verse 1, Exodus 12 verse 38 repeats keywords, phrases, and themes found elsewhere only in Genesis 12:10 and 13:2. That's Genesis chapter 12 verse 10, Genesis 12:10 and Genesis 13:2. This suggests that Israel's exodus is intentionally described to remind the reader of what happened to Abram, not Abraham, Abram. This is before he got his name changed. In both accounts, we find 1. Heavy famine, that's Genesis chapter 12:10, and then Genesis 43 verse 1, and then 2. Descent into Egypt, Genesis chapter 12 verse 10, and then Genesis 46 verse 6. Number 3, a life-threatening situation to the males but not to the females, Genesis chapter 12 verse 12, Exodus chapter 1 verse 16. Number 4 is captivity in Pharaoh's service, Genesis chapter 12 verse 15, Exodus chapter 1 verse 11. Number 5, plagues upon the Egyptians. Again, parallels, Genesis 12:17, Exodus 7 through 12. The 6th parallel is expulsion from Egypt because of the plagues, Genesis 12:20, Exodus 12:33, and the 7th parallel is the departure from Egypt with great wealth, Genesis 12:16, 13:2, as opposed to Exodus 12:35 and 38. Story of Abram and Sarai's sojourn in Egypt due to a great famine, God's striking of the Pharaoh's house with plagues, and their quote-unquote exodus from Egypt with great riches, Genesis 12:10 and 13:2, reveals not only what happened to Abram and Sarai, but also prefigures what will happen to Israel over 400 years later, Genesis 43:1, as opposed to Exodus 12:38. Another example of a literary analogy, Maaseh Avot, is the story of Noah, a figure who intentionally foreshadows Moses. While English readers of the Bible know that God saved Noah and his family from a watery death by means of an ark, in Hebrew it's pronounced the word is teva, Genesis 6:14. Some may be surprised to learn that Moses, was also saved from a watery death in an ark, teva, in Hebrew, Exodus 2, verses 3 and 5. Though the English Standard Version translates teva in Exodus 2, 3, and 5 as basket, this is clearly an exception, since every other time teva is found in the Torah, it means ark. And there's a long string of verses in Genesis, and chapters in Genesis, Genesis 6:14, 16, 18, 19, 7:1, verses 7, 9, 13, 15, 17, and it goes on and on. Moreover, every other time the word basket appears in the English Standard Version, a different Hebrew word is used. In Genesis Numbers, the Hebrew word for basket is sal, Genesis 40:17, Exodus 29:3, Exodus 29:23, 32, Leviticus 8:2, and other coordinates. And in Deuteronomy, the word is tene, Deuteronomy 26:2, 4, Deuteronomy 28:5, and 17. Why would Moses avoid the two proper Hebrew words for basket in favor of a word only used elsewhere to refer to Noah's Ark, if not to make an intentional link between the two stories? This link appears all the more intentional when we consider that in both stories the arks were waterproofed, Genesis 6:14, Exodus 2:3. And these arks served to protect the main characters from drowning. Remarkably, only Noah and Moses receive architectural blueprints for redemptively significant structures from God. Genesis 6:14, verses 14 through 16, Exodus 25 and 31 through 31. These are chapters. Exodus chapter 25 through 31. Noah's importance in God's redemptive purposes, Genesis 5:29, intentionally prefigures Moses' role as Israel's redeemer. I'm going to read that again because that sounds important. Noah's importance in God's redemptive purposes intentionally prefigures Moses' role as Israel's redeemer. Exodus 3:10. Very, very interesting, isn't it? Just as Abram's sojourn in Egypt and Noah's rescue from the waters of death are written as signs of later events, likewise the story of Adam and Eve is written with Israel's future in mind. In other words, by reading about Adam, we can also know what will happen to Israel in the future. So with Israel in mind, we look at the general storyline of the first 3 chapters of Genesis. From Adam and Eve to Israel. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 28, God, number 1, blesses Adam and Eve, and number 2, tells them to be fruitful, and number 3, tells them to subdue and conquer the land. Notice the major elements of God's promises to Avraham, Genesis 12 verses 1 through 3. Blessing, seed, and land contained in this verse. Later in Genesis, God's promises to Abraham and his descendants include all 3 aspects of this creation mandate: blessing, seed, and the conquest of the land. Genesis chapter 14, 18, 15, those are verses. Genesis 18, 26, chapter 26, verses 2 to 4. Genesis 35, Genesis chapter 35, verses 9 to 12. See also Exodus chapter 1, verse 7. Numbers chapter 32, verses 22 and 29. In Genesis 2, God prepares a very special land, garden, for Adam and then brings him into it. Adam's continued enjoyment of this garden is contingent upon the keeping of just a few commandments: be fruitful and subdue the land, and do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Genesis 1:28, Genesis 2:17. In Genesis 3, we are introduced to the serpent, an inhabitant of the garden who deceives Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve should have subdued the serpent, Genesis 1:28, but instead are themselves subdued by the serpent, disobey God's commandments, and are subsequently exiled from the garden eastward, where their descendants eventually find themselves in Babylon. Genesis 11, verses 2 and 9. Does this story sound familiar? Adam's story becomes Israel's story in Joshua through Kings. God blesses Israel and makes them fruitful. He gives them not a few, but 613 mitzvot, commandments. He brings them to the land of Canaan in order to subdue it and to conquer its inhabitants. Their presence in the land is contingent on keeping the law. Like Adam, they break these commandments and are exiled eastward to Babylon. Patterns. Alright, so I'm on page 25 of the book, and there are 2 more footnotes. Footnote number 7, that deals with the story of Adam and Eve is written with Israel's future in mind. So let's take a look at footnote number 7. Footnote number 7 merely says, as recorded in the biblical text. Footnote number 8, on the other hand, deals with the Hebrew word for land, eretz, and this is talking about from Adam and Eve to Israel in Genesis 1:28. God, number 1, blesses Adam and Eve, and number 2, tells them to be fruitful, and 3, tells them to subdue, conquer the land. So land is in italics, and it has a little number 8 over it, and that's the footnote for number 8, which I'm going to read. The Hebrew word for land, eretz, most commonly translated in Genesis 1:28 as world, is most frequently translated as land in the English translations of the Torah. For example, eretz is used 845 times in the Torah. 159 times the ESV translates the word as earth, and 642 times as land. Okay, so that was the end of the 8th footnote. Let us proceed. If the ultimate purpose of Genesis chapters 1 through 11 is to both encourage and to warn Israel to keep the law, It is difficult to see how this introduction achieves that goal. Adam and Eve live in a perfect world. Their continued presence in the garden is contingent on the keeping of only a few commandments, not 613 commandments. Under the best conditions this world has ever seen, Adam and Eve break the only do not law they are given, and consequently die in exile. It is not at all clear how the telling of the story of Adam and Eve's failure to keep one of only a few commandments in a perfect world is supposed to encourage Israel to keep 613 commandments in a fallen world. Actually, it offers no encouragement at all. And if we consider the principles of deeds of the fathers as a sign to the sons, Ma'asei Avot Siman Labanim, Adam's story never was intended to warn Israel from following in Adam's footsteps, i.e., a warning to keep the law. Rather, Adam's story is intended to be a prophecy that Israel will follow in Adam's footsteps. Israel, you will be just like Adam. You will enter the land, be tempted by the Canaanites to follow their ways, you will break the law, and then you will be exiled. Footnote number 9. Footnote number 9. Someone might object to our position by arguing the absurdity of God giving the law to Israel if he knew that they would break it before he gave it. This same argument, however, just as easily applies to God's commandments to Adam and Eve in the garden. Of course, God knew Adam and Eve would break his commandments before he gave them. Likewise, God knew Israel would worship a golden calf before he brought them out of Egypt. God's gracious plan to save the world did not begin when humankind disobeyed. Rather, God planned to redeem the world by means of the Lamb before the foundation of the world. Revelation 13:8. The end echoes the beginning. When we look at the conclusion of the Torah, Deuteronomy chapters 29 through 34, we see exactly the same perspective that we find in the introduction. Moses does not expect Israel to keep the law. Rather, he predicts Israel will break the law and go into exile. In Moses' 40 years with Israel in the wilderness, he experiences Israel breaking the Sinai covenant the moment it was made, Exodus 32, as well as continuous complaining, Exodus chapters 15 verse 24, chapter 16 verses 2, 7 through 8, 17:3, Numbers 11:1, 14:2, chapters 27, 29, 36, chapter 16 verse 11, chapter 17 verse 5 and verse 10. And unbelief, Numbers 14:11, 20:12, Deuteronomy 1:32, Deuteronomy 9:23. These experiences lead him to the conclusion that Israel's enjoyment of the land will be short-lived. In the conclusion of the Torah, Moses prophesies that Israel will assuredly repeat Adam's story by breaking the Sinai covenant and being exiled. When the time arrives that all these things have come upon you, both the blessing and the curse which I have presented to you, and you are there among the nations to which Adonai your God has driven you. Deuteronomy 30, verse 1. Adonai said to Moshe, "You are about to sleep with your ancestors, but this people will get up and offer themselves as prostitutes to the foreign gods of the land where they are going. When they are with these gods, they will abandon me and break my covenant, which I have made with them. Then my anger will flare up, and I will abandon them, and I will hide my face from them. Then they will ask, 'Haven't these calamities come upon us because our God isn't here with us?' But I will be hiding my face from them because of all the evil they will have done in turning to other gods. Therefore write this song for yourselves and teach it to the people of Israel. Have them learn it by heart, so that this song can be a witness for me against the people of Israel. For when I have brought them into the land I swore to their ancestors, flowing with milk and honey, and they have eaten their fill, grown fat, and turned to other gods, serving them and despising me, and broken my covenant. Then after many calamities and troubles have come upon them, this song will testify before them as a witness, because their descendants will still be reciting it and will not have forgotten it. For I know how they think even now, even before I have brought them into the land about which I swore. Deuteronomy 31 verses 16 to 21, Complete Jewish Bible. He made them ride on the heights of the earth. They ate the produce of the fields. He had them suck honey from the rocks and olive oil from the crags, curds from the cows and milk from the sheep, with lamb fat, rams of Bashan and goats, with the finest wheat flour, and you drank sparkling wine from the blood of grapes. But Yeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, thick, gross. He abandoned God his maker. He scorned the rock, his salvation. They roused him to jealousy with alien gods, provoking him with abominations. They sacrificed to demons, non-gods, gods that they have never known, new gods that had come up lately, which your ancestors had not feared. You ignored the rock who fathered you. You forgot God who gave you birth. Adonai saw and was filled with scorn at his sons and daughters' provocation. He said, I will hide my face from them and see what will become of them, for they are a perverse generation, untrustworthy children. They aroused my jealousy with a non-god and provoked me with their vanities. I will arouse their jealousy with a non-people and provoke them with a vile nation. Deuteronomy 32, 13-21, Complete Jewish Bible. The fact that Moses so clearly prophesies Israel's disobedience and exile at the end of the Torah strongly suggests that Adam's story is written with Israel's future disobedience in mind. Failure is assured. Some might object by pointing to the numerous times Moses calls Israel to keep the law. How do we reconcile Moses' pleas to Israel to keep the law on the one hand, with his prophecies that Israel will not keep the law on the other? Perhaps an analogy to this tension between a call for obedience and the certainty of disobedience can be found in Jeremiah. Jeremiah assumes Israel's failure to heed the prophet's numerous warnings to keep the law throughout the book, Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. For instance, Jeremiah implores Israel to keep the Sabbath or else Jerusalem will be burnt. Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 21-22, verses 24, verse 27. But the book of Jeremiah also makes it clear that Israel does not obey, and so we read about Jerusalem's destruction by fire at the end of the book, Jeremiah 52, verse 13. Jeremiah's consistent warnings to keep the law, found throughout the book and which are given prior to the exile, coupled with Israel's failure and exile at the end of the book, help bring its message and its theology more clearly into focus. The ultimate purpose of the book of Jeremiah is not to get Israel to keep the law so they will not be exiled. The ultimate purpose is to tell us how God will graciously save Israel in spite of their disobedience through the Messiah and the New Covenant. Jeremiah chapters 30 all the way through to 33. It is in this light that we more clearly appreciate the Torah's ultimate goal as well. Israel is repeatedly told to keep the law and is promised blessings for obedience, but God graciously and unconditionally promises to bless Israel through the coming Messiah in spite of the certainty of their failure. Since the Torah's introduction and conclusion take for granted, prophetically speaking, Israel's disobedience to the law, it hardly makes sense to suggest that the Torah's purpose is to encourage Israel to keep the law. The Torah's ultimate goal must be conceived not in terms of bringing Israel to the law, but rather in terms of leading Israel through the broken law, through the violated covenant, and beyond. This concludes chapter 1 of Reading Moses Seeing Jesus, titled, The Torah Anticipates Lawbreaking. Chapter 2 of Reading Moses Seeing Jesus is called Failure of Faith Leads to Death, and that will be the core topic of episode 12 of Finding Higher Ground. I do very much hope and pray that this podcast episode was enlightening and full of knowledge, and that somebody somewhere got something out of it. I will leave you, my dear listeners, with the Aaronic blessing. Yivarchecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yechunecha. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. B'shem Yeshua HaMashiach. May Adonai bless you and keep you. May Adonai shine his countenance upon you and be gracious unto you. May Adonai lift his countenance upon you and give you his peace, in the name of Messiah Yeshua. And as Messiah Yeshua loves you all, so do I. You will be hearing from me again. Shalom unishtamea.